Steel doesn't break under heat. It hardens. I learned that early on, swinging a hammer in my father's forge. I didn't know I'd need to apply the same lesson to my own life. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I'm 52 years old, and I own Caldwell Forge, the same blacksmith shop my grandfather built with his own two hands. My days start before sunrise, the glow of the fire lighting up the dark corners of my shop. Ironwood, Montana, isn't much, just a small town where people still look each other in the eye and a man's word means something. I like it that way. I don't waste words, and I don't entertain nonsense. You do right by your work and your people, or you don't belong. Lauren, my wife, used to understand that. She used to respect it. Lately, though, things have shifted. Small things, at first. A change in her perfume, something lighter, citrusy. A new blouse that hugged a little tighter. Text she'd tilt her phone away to read. I noticed, but I didn't say anything. Talking wasn't my way. You let a thing play out, get the full measure of it, and then you strike. One evening, I came home late, the scent of coal and molten metal still clinging to my clothes. The boys were in the den, glued to their screens. Lauren sat at the dining table, a glass of red wine in hand, her laptop open in front of her. The sight of her was familiar, comfortable, except for the way she didn't look up when I walked in. Long day? I asked, setting my gloves on the counter. She nodded, still typing. Yeah, work's been hectic. I poured myself a coffee, black, no sugar. Late nights a lot lately. She hesitated, just for a second. Yeah, we've got a new client. Big account. I took a sip, let the silence stretch. That right? Yeah. She closed the laptop and finally looked at me. Her expression was unreadable, practiced. You okay? Fine. I met her eyes, held them. She looked away first. That was all I needed. The next day, I took my lunch break at Rustler's Cafe, the kind of place where the coffee was burnt but strong, and nobody minded the soot on my sleeves. That's where I saw him. Brandon Wells. Tall, clean-cut, the type of man who spent more time trimming his beard than working with his hands. Real estate, from what I knew. He sat at the counter, stirring sugar into his coffee, smiling at the waitress like he was used to people liking him. I watched him for a while, considering my options. I could walk up to him, put a fist through that smirk, but that wasn't how you handled things. You didn't swing wild. You aimed, you calculated, and when you struck, it was final. When he left, I followed. Not closely, just enough to see the way he walked, confident, like the world had never hit back at him. He got into his car, black Mercedes, of course, and drove off. I made a note of it. Later that night, Lauren was in the shower when her phone buzzed on the nightstand. I wasn't the type to snoop. I didn't need to. The name flashing on the screen told me everything. Brandon Wells. I picked up the phone, turned it over in my palm. I could read the message, but I didn't. The truth was already in front of me. When Lauren stepped out of the bathroom, her hair wrapped in a towel, she froze for half a second when she saw me holding her phone. That half second was all I needed. Something you want to tell me? I asked, my voice even. She swallowed, recovering quickly. Ethan, don't start. I set the phone down on the dresser, careful, deliberate. Not starting anything. Just asking. She exhaled, pulled the towel tighter around herself. It's not what you think. Then tell me what it is. Silence. A crack in the foundation. I nodded. That's what I thought. I didn't yell. Didn't ask for an explanation. Explanations were for men looking for an excuse to forgive. I wasn't one of them. Instead, I walked past her, out the bedroom door. I needed air. Needed space. There was a fire in my chest, burning hotter than the forge, but I wouldn't let it consume me. She had made her choice. Now it was time for me to make mine. I drove. No destination in mind, just the open road and the hum of the truck engine under my hands. The streets of Ironwood were quiet at this hour, most folks settling into their routines, their lives still intact. I passed the hardware store, the diner, the bank where Lauren worked. Her car was parked there every day like clockwork, but I wondered now where else it had been. I tightened my grip on the wheel. Eventually, I pulled into the lot of Silver Horse Gym, a place I only visited when I needed to clear my head with iron and sweat. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I walked in, the familiar scent of rubber mats and old metal weights filling my lungs. The regulars were there, guys who worked hard and lifted heavier. Max spotted me first. He was in his usual spot by the squat rack, chalk dust on his hands, sweat darkening his shirt. He was built like a dam tank, ex-military, ex-married, and the only guy in town who could deadlift more than me. You look like hell, he said, tossing me a water bottle. I caught it, cracked the seal, took a long drink. Long week. He grunted, studying me like he already knew something was off. You here to lift? Or to think? Both. I grabbed a pair of heavy dumbbells and started pressing, feeling the weight push the fire inside me down, tempering it. Mac didn't press for details. He never did. But after a few sets, he leaned on the rack, arms crossed. You know, he said, you keep quiet, but I've been around long enough to recognize a man with a problem. I set the weights down, rolling out my shoulders. You ever been cheated on, Mac? His jaw tightened. He exhaled through his nose. Yeah. How'd you handle it? He smirked, but there was no humor in it. Poorly, at first. Then I handled it right. I waited. He cracked his neck. Lost my temper. Broke things. Almost got myself arrested. That was the poor part. The right part? I took control of my damn life. Didn't let her or him get the satisfaction of seeing me broken. I nodded slowly. He tilted his head. You find out for sure? I thought about Lauren's hesitation, about the name flashing on her screen. Yeah. He nodded like he'd already figured that. Don't do anything stupid. I won't. Good. He smirked. But if you need a guy to spot you while you make his life hell, you know where to find me. That got the first real grin out of me all day. I left the gym feeling clearer, more settled in my mind. This wasn't a situation you yelled about. It wasn't a fight in the street. It was a slow, deliberate takedown. I'd spent my life forging things, shaping metal into something strong, something lasting. Now, I was going to take something apart just as carefully. The next morning, I got up before sunrise, same as always. Fired up the forge, let the heat settle into my bones. Work kept my hands busy, my mind sharp. Lauren came down around 7, dressed for work in one of her usual pressed blouses and heels. She hesitated when she saw me, like she wasn't sure how to act. I made coffee, she said, setting her mug on the counter. I nodded, barely looking up from the piece of iron I was shaping. She shifted on her feet. Are we going to talk? I flipped the metal with the tongs, watching the heat ripple across its surface. About what? She exhaled, frustrated. You know what? I turned to look at her then. If I know, and you know, what's left to talk about? Her jaw tightened. Ethan, this isn't. I didn't let her finish. I'll tell you what it is. It's a damn shame. But don't worry, I'm not the kind of man who makes a scene. That threw her. She opened her mouth, then shut it. I went back to my work. You'll be late for your big client. Her breath caught just a little. And then, without another word, she grabbed her keys and left. I set the iron back in the flames, watched it glow. It wasn't time to strike yet. But soon, I let things play out. That was the key. You don't rush steel in the forge. You let the heat do its work, let the impurities rise to the surface before you hammer them out. This was no different. Lauren carried on like nothing had changed. If she suspected I knew, she didn't let it show. But there was a shift, a tension in the way she moved around the house. Her phone never left her side now. She locked it when she set it down, angled it away when she checked messages. She was careful, but not careful enough. I watched. I waited. I started making small changes. Nothing drastic. Nothing that could be traced back to me. Just enough to make her feel like the ground beneath her was shifting. The first was at work. She kept all her important files in a sleek leather folder she took to meetings. That folder was always in the same spot by the front door, set out the night before so she wouldn't forget it. I knew her schedule, knew when she had a big presentation lined up. The night before, while she was in the shower, I took the folder, slid the papers out, replaced them with blank sheets, set it back exactly as it was. The next morning, I stood in the kitchen, drinking coffee when she grabbed it on her way out. Got a big meeting today? I asked. She barely looked up from her phone. Yeah, hope it goes well, I said, and I meant it. Because well or not, it was going to be a meeting she wouldn't forget. I spent the morning at the forge, hammering out an order of custom gate hinges for a rancher up north. It was good, solid work. Kept my hands busy, my mind steady. Around noon, I wiped the sweat from my neck and checked my phone. 3 missed calls from Lauren. I let them go to voicemail. By the time I came in for lunch, she was home. That was unusual. She never came home during the day. She stood in the kitchen, her bag dumped on the counter, pacing in tight circles. She turned when I walked in. Something's wrong with my work files, she said, her voice tight. I opened my folder, and everything was blank. I don't know how it happened. I opened the fridge, pulled out a beer, twisted the cap off. That right? Yes, that's right. She stared at me like she was waiting for a reaction. I took a slow drink. Weird. She folded her arms. You think this is funny? I set the bottle down, met her eyes. Not laughing. She looked away, ran a hand through her hair. I had to reschedule the whole meeting. My boss was furious. Sounds like a rough morning, I said. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. I don't understand how this happened. I shrugged. Maybe you're distracted. Her eyes snapped back to mine. For just a second, there was something there. A flicker of suspicion. But she pushed it down. She wasn't ready to believe I'd do anything. Not yet. She grabbed her bag. I have to go back in. Good luck with that, I said, taking another sip of my beer as she walked out. That was just the beginning. Over the next few days, I turned the screws a little tighter. I kept it quiet, subtle. Things moved around. Her car keys weren't where she left them. Emails she swore she sent never arrived. The TV remote, always on the coffee table, found its way into the fridge. Small things, just enough to make her doubt herself. And then I let her catch me watching her. Not all the time. Just enough. A glance across the room, held a second too long. A pause when she walked past. A slight tilt of the head when she checked her phone. Nothing outright confrontational, nothing she could call me on. But enough to make her wonder. One night, she finally snapped. I was sitting in my chair by the fireplace, reading an old book on metallurgy. She stood across from me, arms crossed, her jaw set. Are you trying to mess with me? She demanded. I turned a page. Didn't look up. What are you talking about? She took a step forward. Things keep going missing. My files, my emails. You keep looking at me like, she broke off, frustrated. I set the book down on my lap. Like what? Her hands clenched. Like you know something. I met her gaze, steady and unblinking. Should I? Her throat moved as she swallowed. She held the stare longer than I expected before looking away. This is ridiculous, she muttered, turning on her heel. I picked up my book again. Good night, Lauren. She didn't answer. I watched her walk away, her shoulders a little tighter than before. The cracks were showing. It wouldn't be long now. Lauren didn't bring it up again, but I could see the weight of it settling on her. She was second-guessing herself now. Checking things twice. Triple-checking. The morning routine took longer because she was making sure her files were right. Her keys were where she left them. The control she prided herself on was slipping. I just kept working, keeping my hands busy, my expression neutral. Letting her wonder. I stopped by Rustler's Cafe that afternoon. Ordered black coffee, no sugar. The place was slow around this time, too late for lunch, too early for dinner. I took a seat near the window, let my eyes drift casually over the street. That's when I saw him. Brandon Wells, walking out of Ironwood Realty, dressed in the kind of button-down shirt that never saw a day of hard labor. He checked his phone, smirked at something, and slid into his car. Same damn Mercedes. I finished my coffee and left a few bucks on the table. Took my time walking back to my truck, giving him a head start. No rush. Just a casual drive through town, heading in the same direction. He pulled into Bentley's Taproom, a bar on the edge of town. Midweek, it wouldn't be busy. Just regulars and the occasional salesman looking to kill time. I parked a few spaces down, waited a minute before stepping inside. Dim lighting, the smell of old wood and spilled beer. A few guys at the bar, nursing drinks, watching a muted sports channel. Brandon sat in a booth near the back, phone in hand, grinning at the screen like a man who thought he had everything figured out. I walked past, slow enough to catch a glimpse. Can't wait to see you tonight. I recognized the number. My own wife's. I felt the heat rise in my chest, slow and controlled. But I didn't stop. Didn't change my stride. I ordered a beer at the bar, took my time drinking it. When I left, I didn't look back. That night, I let Lauren get comfortable. Let her go through her usual routine. Dinner with the boys. A glass of wine while she typed away on her laptop. She probably thought things were settling down, that I had dropped it. An hour later, she went upstairs. I stayed put. Waited until I heard the sound of water running in the bathroom. Then I took her phone. I didn't go looking for anything. Didn't need to. The text thread was open. She hadn't even bothered to hide it. Brandon, 9 p.m., Bentley's. Same booth. Lauren, can't stay long. Just a drink. Brandon, that's what you said last time. Lauren, this has to stop. Brandon, you sure about that? I locked the screen, set the phone back exactly where I found it, and went to bed. The next morning, I left earlier than usual. Stopped by a print shop before heading to the forge. Picked up a fresh stack of paper. Nothing fancy, just enough to get the message across. By noon, a handful of flyers were taped to street poles around Ironwood Realty. A few more made their way onto cars in the lot at Ironwood Community Bank. And just for good measure, A final set found their way into the break room at Bentley's taproom. Black and white. Plain text. Nothing dramatic. Just the facts. Brandon Wells, professional liar. Available for house sales and other people's wives. I signed it, a concerned husband. Then I went back to work, set a new piece of steel in the forge, and waited for the fire to do its job. By the time the flyers had done their work, ironwood was buzzing. Small towns run on word of mouth, and it doesn't take much to start a fire. People talked at the cafe, whispered at the bank, exchanged looks at the grocery store. By lunchtime, Brandon Wells wasn't just a name anymore. He was a headline. I was in the forge when the first call came. I let it ring. The second came minutes later. Then a third. When my phone went off a fourth time, I wiped the sweat from my hands, walked outside, and answered. Lauren's voice was tight. What the hell did you do? I leaned against my truck, watching the heat shimmer off the pavement. Something wrong. Don't play dumb, Ethan, she snapped. Flyers. Everywhere. At my work. At his work. What the hell were you thinking? I took a slow breath, let it stretch the silence between us. I was thinking people should know the kind of man they're dealing with. You humiliated me. No, I corrected. You did that yourself. She didn't respond right away. I heard the strain in her breathing, the way she was fighting for control. Brandon's boss saw them. He's losing clients. He might lose his job. I didn't say anything. My boss saw them too, she went on. I've been pulled into a meeting this afternoon. HR. I pushed off the truck, stretched my shoulders. That right. Damn it, Ethan. The anger cracked, and something desperate leaked through. Do you have any idea what you've done? People are looking at me like, she cut herself off. You don't just get to do this. I let the words settle. Sure I do. She made a sharp sound of frustration. You want a divorce? Fine. Say the word. But this is cruel. I glanced back at the forge, at the steady glow of the fire inside. Cruel? I echoed. No, Lauren. Cruel would have been letting our boys find out the way I did. Cruel would have been walking into Bentley's last night and handling things with my fists. I didn't do that. You're enjoying this, she accused. I shook my head, even though she couldn't see it. I'm just making sure the truth sees daylight. She inhaled sharply, about to say something else, then stopped herself. When she spoke again, her voice was lower. Are you happy now? I considered that. Not yet. Then I hung up. By late afternoon, the fallout had started to settle. Brandon's office put out a statement, vague and corporate, about internal matters. His car was still in the lot, but he hadn't been seen all day. Lauren's office had gone quiet too. A few of her co-workers followed me on social media, small-town networking at its finest, and by evening, my inbox was full of messages. Not all of them sympathetic. Some folks thought I'd gone too far. Others thought I hadn't gone far enough. It didn't matter. After dinner, I was in the shop when I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. The door creaked open, and I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Mac leaned against the workbench, arms crossed. Heard you had an eventful day. I kept my focus on the metal I was shaping, letting the hammer do the talking. Word gets around. He huffed. Hell, Ethan, you're the one spreading it. I flipped the piece, hit it again. Figured it was time for people to know what they're dealing with. Yeah, well, they know now. He watched me work for a minute. So what's next? I didn't answer right away. Let the rhythm of the hammer fill the space. Then I set the iron aside, met his eyes. She's got a meeting with HR tomorrow. His brows lifted slightly. Bet that'll be fun. She'll survive it. And Wells. I wiped my hands on a rag, tossed it aside. He'll do what men like him always do. Find another town, another woman, another life to ruin. Max studied me, then nodded once. You done? I exhaled. Not yet. He grinned. Thought so. The forge crackled behind me, steady and unshaken. Lauren came home late. I was in the garage, oiling a set of tongs, when I heard the car pull into the driveway. The engine cut off, but she didn't get out right away. She sat there, probably gathering herself, preparing for whatever conversation she thought was coming. I waited. Finally, the door opened, and her heels clicked against the pavement. A second later, she stepped into the garage, arms crossed, face tight. She looked like she wanted a fight. She wasn't going to get one. You made your point, she said. I kept working. Did I? She scoffed. HR put me on unpaid leave while they review the situation. You happy now? I set the tongs down, wiped my hands on a rag. Not my decision. Guess they didn't like what they saw. You know damn well it's because of those flyers. Maybe. I met her eyes. Or maybe they don't trust someone who can't keep her personal and professional life separate. She flinched, just for a second, then covered it with a hard stare. And what about you? What happens now? You keep punishing me? Dragging this out. I leaned against the workbench, folding my arms. That depends. On what? On you. I let the words settle. You can leave town. Run like Wells probably will. Or you can stay and deal with what you've done. She exhaled through her nose, anger still simmering, but something else creeping in now. A kind of exhaustion. She rubbed her temple. And what about us? There is no us, Lauren. For a moment, she didn't move. Then her jaw tightened. Fine. She turned to leave, but stopped at the doorway. I never wanted to hurt you. I nodded once. You just didn't care enough not to. She had nothing to say to that. A minute later, I heard her walking upstairs, heard the bedroom door close. I didn't follow. The next morning, I didn't see her before I left for the forge. When I got back that evening, her car was gone. By the end of the week, so was she. No big send-off, no last attempt to fix things. Just an empty closet and a note on the counter saying she'd be staying with her sister for a while. No apology. No explanation. Just a quiet exit, like that somehow made it better. I burned the note. Word around town was that Brandon had taken an extended business trip. No one expected him back. His wife had packed up and left first. By the following Monday, his name was off the company website, his face off the billboards. It didn't take long before people stopped talking about him. Lauren, though, that was different. She still had roots here. Friends. A reputation that was now in pieces. Some people stood by her, said everyone makes mistakes. Others didn't. Either way, it wasn't my problem anymore. One night, I was locking up the forge when Mac pulled up in his truck. He hopped out, tossed me a six-pack. Figured it was about time for a drink. I cracked one open, took a long pull. Yeah. He nodded toward the road. Heard from the guys at the gym. Wells isn't coming back. His wife's filing for divorce. Guess she didn't appreciate seeing her husband's name posted all over town. Shame. Max smirked. Lauren's staying away for good. I shrugged. I don't care either way. He eyed me, then nodded. Good. We stood there a while, drinking in silence. The night air was cool, the sky clear. After a few minutes, he glanced at the forge. What's next for you? I looked at the shop, at the steady, worn place my father had built, the work still waiting inside. Same thing as always. Mac grinned. Figured as much. The fire inside the forge flickered, steady as ever. Some things don't break. They just get stronger. A month passed. Then another. Lauren didn't come back. Not that I expected her to. She settled a few towns over, got a job at some finance firm. Someone told me she was keeping a low profile, but I didn't care enough to ask twice. We signed the divorce papers through our lawyers. No yelling, no drawn-out fights. She got her car and her savings. I kept the house and the forge. The boys stayed with me. They were old enough to decide, and they didn't hesitate. Brandon Wells. Last I heard, he was trying to rebuild his career somewhere out of state, but his name had a stink to it now. People don't forget that kind of thing, not in business. His wife took him to court and gutted him in the divorce. The last thing I heard was that he was living out of some rental, trying to convince new clients he wasn't the piece of shit they could all Google and read about. Ironwood moved on. People still whispered when Lauren's name came up, but most of them had their own lives to worry about. The flyers had done their job. People knew. That was enough. I threw myself into work. Bigger orders came in. The forge had always been steady, but now it was thriving. Some contractor from out of state placed a bulk order for custom ironwork, said he heard about me through word of mouth. That was fine by me. I wasn't the kind of man who needed a fresh start. I just needed to double down on what was already mine. Mac and I started lifting more together. He said it was good for the mind as much as the body. He wasn't wrong. I pushed more weight, let the heat of the gym and the forge do their work. People noticed. You're looking solid these days, Mac said one afternoon, spotting me on the bench. More than usual. Steel doesn't break under heat, I said, setting the bar back in place. He grinned. Damn right. The kids adjusted. Josh picked up some shifts at the hardware store after school. Caleb started spending more time at the forge, watching, asking questions. One day, he stood by while I worked on a custom gate. You ever think about doing something else? He asked, arms folded, his tone neutral. I wiped sweat from my brow. Like what? He shrugged. I don't know. Moving. Starting fresh somewhere. I set my hammer down, looked at him. You think I need a fresh start? He hesitated, then shook his head. Nah, just wondering. I picked up the piece I was working on, examined the lines, the structure. Solid. Strong. Roots matter, son, I said. You don't run from fire. You work through it. He nodded. Thought about that for a while. The next day, he asked if he could start learning the trade for real. I handed him a hammer and let him swing. That was all I needed. One evening, a couple of months later, I stepped out onto the porch with a cold beer. The town was quiet, the kind of quiet you only get in a place where people trust their neighbors. The forge's glow still flickered through the windows, steady and strong. Mac pulled up, killed the engine, climbed out. Beer? I asked, holding one up. He took it, twisted the cap off. Hell of a year, huh? I took a drink, looking out at the horizon. Something like that. You regret anything? I thought about it for a second, then shook my head. Nope. He exhaled, nodding. Good. We stood there, drinking in silence. The night was cool, the stars bright. The kind of night that reminds a man that some things burn away, but what's real, what's strong, that stays. I wasn't broken. I wasn't bitter. I was just here, doing what I'd always done. Building, forging, standing my ground. Some things don't break. They just get stronger.